Okay. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming. It's lovely to see you here. As Cameron has said, the title of my talk, and as you see up here, is Crowds in World History. And this is the subject of my current research project. So why crowds, you might ask? Ironically, the idea for this project came to me in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic, when I wasn't able to get to the archives in South Africa. I wanted to research the history of an episode of urban unrest in Cape Town during 1906, which I mentioned already. It's called the Hooligan Riots. But I had to content myself with reading academic literature on protest crowds in the history of Europe. But while I was doing this, a crowd disease, that is, a disease that spreads easily in crowded conditions, ravaged the world. There was nothing particularly unique about COVID-19 in this sense, and indeed two other significant pandemics in history, influenza and the plague, are also, or were also, crowd diseases. But I was struck that in this age of a rampant crowd disease in the 21st century, what did we see? We saw enormous protest crowds gathering. During the spring and summer of 2020, I thought it was interesting to observe a paradox. Socially distanced Black Lives Matter protests, as the kind you see here, was a protest in The Hague on the 2nd of June 2020 to protest after the police killing of George Floyd in the USA. And you see how everybody is standing socially distanced and masked. So those protests, but BLM protests, were going on in the spring and summer of 2020. And at the same time, you had these sort of protests, anti-lockdown protests, and this is one from California on the 1st of May 2020. So you have this paradox of these two different sorts of crowds assembling in the context of this rampant crowd disease. And that struck me as interesting. So the lockdown protesters did not have much in common with the BLM protesters, but they both resisted rules that aimed to some extent to outlaw crowds. So that is, the impetus to gather as a crowd transcended ideological differences between these two groups. This led me to the rather banal observation that crowds remain central to protest in contemporary times. But instead of taking this point for granted, I decided I should work on a deeper explanation of protest crowds that extended beyond the so-called hooligans of early 20th century Cape Town. Hence my book, Crowds in World History. So I'll just show you that I think probably shows you the crowd a bit better than the other picture. So I'll leave that one up for now. In constructing a global history of crowds, I think it's important to say, as you've already heard as well, that I think of crowds as simply more than just aggregations of people. So more than just a gathering of people. There's more than just people getting together. I'm interested to examine how people become conscious of being part of a crowd and how in turn such crowds develop their own social momentum. We need to ask who instigated crowds, who composed them, and who led them. And indeed, what defines the crowd? Who or what was the target of the crowd's activities? How should we interpret the outlook, objectives, and behavior of crowds? To what extent should we view crowds as embodying broader social and political aims, as well as being fleeting, sometimes irrational examples of collective action? I don't envisage answering all these questions today, but I've laid them out before you, so you have some idea of the considerations that are framing my study. So back in 2020, I found two particular Black Lives Matter protests particularly interesting. I'll describe these briefly before going on to some ideas about crowds in history. But most of my presentation today is concerned with 4 case studies of colonial crowds: Mexico City in 1692, Jamaica in 1865, Cape Town in 1906, and Eastern Nigeria in 1929. These crowds were all very different, but what they had in common was that they all assembled in a colonial setting. So I'll conclude with some thoughts about what is distinctive about colonial crowds and why this is important for writing a world history of crowds. So let me begin with these two Black Lives Matter protests that made me think we needed a deeper historical explanation of crowds. On the 1st of June 2020, amid Black Lives Matter protests in Washington, DC and across the United States, tear gas, rubber bullets and batons were used to clear a crowd from Lafayette Square, a public park opposite the White House. This was to enable President Trump to pose for a photograph outside St. John's Episcopal Church while holding a Bible above his head. Less than a week later, across the Atlantic, a statue of the English slave trading merchant Edward Colston was toppled and thrown into Bristol Harbour by a group of British BLM protesters. And both these incidents caused widespread outrage across the political spectrum. But to me, understanding these events focused our attention on different historical narratives of crowds. One narrative is that of order against chaos, which Trump attempted to personify in his stance for the photo op. And here he is at his photo op. Immediately, he stood in front of the church, and simultaneous when officers in riot gear advanced on the crowd, Trump gave a speech in the White House Rose Garden declaring, "I am your president of law and order and an ally of all peaceful protesters." Numerous witnesses stated that the crowd was calm and peaceful until the police advanced. TV viewers watched Trump speak with smoke drifting into the air on a split screen that juxtaposed images and sounds from Lafayette Square, showing the crowd being violently dispersed. In this way, rather than imposing order, Trump generated chaos and made the crowd into a more menacing spectacle, which is what I think you see in this image here, a kind of menacing spectacle of smoke and the crowd and statues, and it's all a bit unknown as to what's happening there, but it looks very ominous. So he made the crowd into a rather more menacing spectacle, Trump did. He tried to use the Bible to reference his righteousness, but what most commentators saw was authoritarianism. So here was a classic example of the use of force revealing fear, political weakness, and illegitimacy. And it was the crowd that exposed that the emperor had no clothes, if you like. In turn, a connection to mob justice offers one reading of the dumping of Edward Colston's statue into the nearest body of water. As a form of social violence that has been a feature of human history for millennia, mob justice defines the crowd as the seed of anarchy against the rule of law. By contrast, a second competing narrative personifies the mob not as a threat to order, but as a motor of emancipation. According to this reading, the crowd of men and women who toppled Colston's statue were inspired by histories of slave resistance and embodied legitimate anti-racist sentiment. You might have seen that the so-called Colston Four were acquitted by a jury in Bristol, which has continued this discussion of the mob as both a force of lawlessness and an exemplar of historical change. And again, over the Atlantic, a mob notoriously invaded the Capitol building in Washington, DC on the 6th of January 2021 to protest Biden's inauguration as president. And the extent to which this crowd was directed and intentional, as opposed to randomly out of control, remains a live issue in American politics today. So my point here, and I hope you may hold this view anyway, but my main point here is that crowds are central to contemporary history. The examples I've described are from the United States and the UK, but there have been significant protest crowds all over the world in recent times, from Hong Kong to Thailand to Lebanon to Nigeria and to Sudan, just to name a few examples. And you might have other examples in mind. Perhaps we can discuss them when we get to the discussion, even from your own experience. But what I want to do in my book, Crowds in World History, is think about what a global perspective might offer to our understanding of crowds more generally. So I'll now move on to exploring how crowds have been conceptualized historically, and then I introduce my case studies. So I've emphasized that there's a pervasive view that crowds are dangerous, uncontrolled, and criminal mobs which threaten civilization. A French theorist was particularly influential in generating this view, and he was called Gustave Flaubert, whose book you see on your left. And for Flaubert, the natural order of things was for the ruling elite to maintain civilization in order to hold back the potential chaos of the masses. His articulation of the threat of the masses, and indeed his making of this social category of the masses, was very influential. He elaborated his ideas in a book titled Psychologie des foules, which was published in 1895 and translated, as you see here, as The Crowd, a study of the popular mind. And it became one of the founding texts of crowd psychology, and it's still in print today. Flaubert contended that crowd sentiments represented the, quote, atavistic residuum of the instincts of primitive man, in which reason was paralyzed and momentary passions held sway. For Flaubert, crowds were symptomatic of a broader social malaise in industrial society, and to be part of an organized crowd meant, quote, descending several rungs in the ladder of civilization. Another crucial element of his thinking was the notion that crowds generated a kind of collective unconscious that took over the capacity of individuals to think and act. He viewed this loss of individual agency as pathological and extremely dangerous for social order. As he put it, an individual in a crowd is a grain of sand amid other grains of sand, which the wind stirs up at will. Flaubert profoundly negative assessment of crowds was directly challenged by the British Marxist historian Georges Roudet in his book, The Crowd in History, which you see here. And this was published in 1964. This work of social history, also still in print, focused on crowds in 18th and 19th century England and France. Roudet was particularly concerned to document the history of popular protest from below, and he sought to prove that crowd activity had social purpose rather than being mindless pathological disorder. Of interest to Roudet was the social composition of the crowd, which he documented by lists of those arrested, killed, or injured, and an assessment of its aims and targets, documented by a chronology of crowd behavior. Significantly, Roudet limited his definition of the crowd to include only social protest. As he wrote, we may exclude from our present considerations crowds that are casually joined together like sightseers, crowds assembled on purely ceremonial occasions, or crowds taking part in religious or academic professions. Audience crowds, like yourselves, who gather in lecture halls, at baseball matches or bullfights. Equally, we should exclude those more active or expressive crowds, and by that he meant crowds assembled by cultural events. He sums up, our main attention will be given to political demonstrations and to what sociologists have called the aggressive mob or the hostile outbursts, to such activities as strikes, rebellions, insurrections, and revolutions. Although it's been criticized for being too narrow, this definition of the crowd has been highly influential. I seek to challenge the Eurocentrism of Roudet's analysis in my book, but like him, I focus mostly on protest crowds. And that's again, perhaps something we can discuss as to whether we should limit discussion of the history of crowds to protest crowds and what other crowds we might include. So, what does a crowd in world history look like? I argue that colonial crowds are a good place to start. Let's begin with Mexico City in 1692. As the historian Arnaud Expelin describes it, referencing Rude, everything began in the style of a classic Ancien Regime grain crisis. There had been hail and heavy rains, and there was a lack of grain. A religious festival, the celebration of the Corpus Christi, was underway. At about 4 p.m. on the 8th of June 1692, a crowd of mostly indigenous people jostled to get the last handfuls of corn at the grain exchange, a building on the Plaza Mayor, which was the main town square. One of them, a pregnant woman, fainted and died. Following this incident, the crowd, carrying the body of the dead woman, headed towards the town hall to hold the colonial magistrate to account. The magistrate, however, had disappeared. The crowd broke down the entrance door to his apartment and ransacked it. Next, they moved to the Archbishop's Palace on the other side of the plaza, but guards deterred them from entering. After that, they marched to the main door of the Viceregal Palace and were twice stopped from entering, upon which they began throwing stones. They lynched the palace guards and then started a fire that ultimately reduced the palace to ashes. As they moved around the plaza, the crowd shouted, "Long live the king," and "Death to bad government." They also set fire to other symbols of power, the gallows, the prison, and the town hall. Expelin argues that the movement of the crowd directly outlines the hierarchy of the authorities in charge of the administration of the city. And this is what this slide is showing, the way that the crowd moves around the square and sets alight and acts against symbols of Spanish colonial power. So to this extent, the way in which the attacks on these buildings are targeted, it does appear to fit with Rude's arguments about the targeted nature of crowd actions. A specific grievance was the ban on the sale of pulque, which was a beer made from the fermented juice of the agave plant. Although elderly indigenous women were allowed to consume it in small quantities, vendors who'd previously sold it on the Plaza Mayor were banned from doing so. Importantly, although indigenous people were the largest component of the crowd, mestizos, or mixed-race people, and poor whites, many of whom were aggrieved market vendors, were in the mix too. So in this way, the social makeup of the crowd was to some extent a reflection of the lower ranks of colonial society. According to the authorities, the 1692 riot was the explosive product of a lack of civility among the Indians, who got drunk on pulque and infected the Plaza Mayor with their bad manners, disrespecting the royal authority of the space. 3 years after the incident, the Viceroy commissioned a painting of Plaza Mayor, which showed the ruined facade of his palace. And that's not very, doesn't show very well, does it? So yeah, I think in the resolution, it just hasn't come up very well. But you can see the outline of the square there, and in this painting, the back of that building is shown as crumbled and burnt down. So it is quite interesting that such a painting was even made, because of course it really acknowledged that this riot had taken place. And it showed the kind of ruined facade of the palace, rather than seeking to hide that this event had taken place. But the riot became known as the Tumult de los Indios in official records, a name that in some ways attempted to downplay the political demands of the crowd and also denied its social complexity. But we must acknowledge that this was a colonial crowd which targeted the material and symbolic power of Spanish colonial government while simultaneously venerating the king. My next example is almost 2 centuries later and concerns 19th century Jamaica. This was actually an incredibly complex series of events which became known as the Morant Bay Rebellion. However, I'll focus here only on the crowd that instigated this uprising, which had specific grievances about the administration of justice in a post-slave society. About 3 p.m. on the 11th of October 1865, a crowd of people marched into Morant Bay, the capital of St. Thomas Parish. So this is Morant Bay here, and this is St. Thomas Parish. So you see, it's in the far east of the island. They carried a red flag and were like a mob, dancing and blowing horns, but came with some intention. A small number had guns. Most of the others had sharpened cutlasses, sticks. One observer noted, they came in rows. They were well packed together, close behind each other, but not at all straggling. They advanced slowly and deliberately. Though dressed in ordinary labourers' clothes, they looked more like troops than an irregular mob. The majority were from a village called Stony Gut and other neighbouring settlements, from where they were heard to receive encouragement from women along the road, who called out, "Flog them." The crowd's first stop was a police station. They disarmed the policemen there and took down all the swords, guns, and pistols and demanded ammunition. But the police had none, and none of the guns had any flints, making them useless. One member of the crowd raised his cutlass to kill a policeman, but another man prevented him, saying, "You are not to kill your colour." Having found no more weapons, the crowd advanced towards the courthouse, blowing shells and horns and beating drums. Parish officials came out onto the balcony to see people brandishing the arms they had taken from the police station. Kettleholt, the principal magistrate of the parish, called out, "Peace in Her Majesty's name." The crowd responded, "No peace, hell today." Kettleholt asked for a copy of the Riot Act and began reading it. But before he had finished, the women in the crowd began throwing stones at the volunteer militia guarding the courthouse. Next, the crowd started hurling glass bottles and physically assaulting the militia. Several of the militia were badly beaten and relieved of their guns, while others began shooting at the crowd. Although some of them were killed and others wounded, the crowd charged again before the militia could reload their weapons. And interestingly, women were instrumental to this sustained assault on the courthouse. After the militia fired and some men fled, they were reportedly told, "Now, you men, this is not what you said on the mountain. You said you would come to the bay and do so-and-so, and now you leave all this work to the women. Go to the parade and see what the volunteers do to the men there." The militia were forced to barricade themselves inside the courthouse along with the parish officials. After about 2 hours, the crowd decided that the best method of attack was to burn down the courthouse and force everyone out. And later reports testified that women were responsible for this plan as well. Once the courthouse was on fire, chaos ensued as those inside were forced to flee. Kettleholt was caught, dragged along by the crowd and beaten to death. Nonetheless, there were also moments of order amid mayhem, such as when the crowd marched to the district prison, again in military fashion, led by the deacon of Stony Gut Baptist Church, Paul Bogle. 51 prisoners were liberated, and Bogle insisted that they must get their own clothes, for he would not like to rebel against the Queen, and he would not strike as a rebel against the Queen, and so they wanted their own clothing. The prison officer was made to open the chest where the personal clothes of the prisoners were kept and hand them out. Bogle also had the prison officers swear on a Bible that they would no longer serve as public officers. They were to go home and work for themselves. Vogel then formed the prisoners into a line and marched them out of the prison. Apart from the burned out courthouse and adjacent school, there was little other destruction in the town of Morant Bay, nor was there significant looting or pillaging. When troops landed on the 12th of October, 1865, they found the dead and many of the wounded in the area around the courthouse. In all, 18 parish officials and volunteer militia were killed, along with 7 members of the crowd. 31 others were wounded. The response of British colonial authorities to this incident was notoriously brutal, and subsequent events have received rather more historical attention than this crowd who began the Morant Bay Rebellion. There's much to discuss, I think, here, but let me move on to my next case study. But 3 particular points I'd like to highlight are: first, the racial discourse that the crowd articulated; second, the important role of women; and third, the significance of prisoners having their clothes returned to them before being absorbed into a crowd which specifically articulated that it was not against the Queen. So now we move to the 20th century, and the incident that sparked my historical interest in crowds, which was an episode of urban unrest in Cape Town, South Africa during 1906, just a few years after the end of the South African War. Oh, sorry, I should just go back to, so this is a painting of the attack on the courthouse. So you see that it's being set on fire, and it certainly kind of conveys, I suppose, a chaotic mob. But you don't see the prisoners marching out with their personal clothes on. So the Hooligan Riots, this was a time of economic depression and high unemployment, characterized by growing calls for government intervention. On the 6th of August 1906, a delegation, most of whom were white British socialists, went to meet the Prime Minister and put their case for unemployment relief. They were accompanied to Parliament by a very wretched-looking crowd. That's a quote from a newspaper article, which police estimated at 1,200 people, although the South African News put the number at 2,500. Accounts concurred that the crowd contained only a small minority of Europeans and was made up mostly of coloureds or mixed-race people and a few Africans. While the crowd waited outside, the delegation spent 2 hours with the Prime Minister and were then promised assistance for the destitute wives and children of white men. Once finished with their meeting, the delegation marched with the crowd from Parliament Street to Cape Town's Central Parade. More speeches were made, some of which were alleged to have incited the crowd to steal. At this point, the Cape Argus reported the unemployed were supplemented by gangs of young coloured hooligans. The political meeting gave way to disorder as the crowd dispersed and took to the streets of the city, attacking shops and looting. The crowd, intoxicated with success, as the newspaper put it, ran from block to block and carried off all that was exposed for sale. Although the police were out in full force, they were powerless against the fleet-footed looters. The windows of several shops were smashed. The disturbances continued into the night, by which time the crowd was thought to have swelled to 700 or 800 people. Thanks to reinforcements, the police eventually regained a semblance of control and made several arrests. The next day, however, unrest continued. 9 shops owned by Indian merchants were attacked by a noisy, stone-throwing crowd. General dealer Ali Hussein recounted that 2 women, Lily Peterson and Maria Machari, came into his shop asking for bread and flour. He knew the women as they lived close by. When he said he didn't have bread or flour, Peterson warned him that he would see in a few minutes what would happen to the shop. A big crowd then came in and shouted that the government had told them to take things from my shop. They kicked out the glass panel in the door and helped themselves to biscuits and 100 bundles of firewood. A schoolboy witness, Edward Jackson, reported that 2 men from the crowd took it in turns to hold Hewson back, while others threw the wood out of the shop. A local policeman, seeing rice and biscuits scattered over the road, asked a group of people where they had got the loaves of bread, flour and biscuits they were carrying. They gave no account, he said, and were very impudent. One of the accused was found to have his pockets crammed with biscuits. The head constable, Claude Miles, declared that he knew another of the men well, having seen him loafing about the streets for weeks. All in all, crowds roamed Cape Town for 3 days in early August 1906, smashing shop windows, stealing goods, demanding food, and engaging the police in running street battles. They gathered menacingly on the central square known as the Parade, generating a decided undercurrent of mischief. What became known as the Hooligan Riots were finally quelled by the evening of 9th of August with support from mounted police and military volunteers. Compared to our other 2 examples, these so-called hooligans appear to be less motivated by political intent. Nevertheless, the historian Robin Hallett argues that they had affinities with the city mobs of pre-industrial Europe, of the kind studied by Rude. Hallett remarked that this is evident in how neither of them were inspired by a specific ideology, but both were movements of the urban poor who sought change by direct action. All the same, we know very little about who these hooligans actually were and how they saw themselves in the crowd. It's worth noting that of the 13 individuals charged in connection with the events of 7th of August, only one of the accused was actually born in Cape Town. They appear to be first-generation immigrants and probably did not belong to a criminally hardened, dangerous class. Indeed, the trial notes recorded that some of them were actually employed and not unemployed, as the newspapers tried to make out. Their average age was 20 years, with the oldest 22 and the youngest 17. Again, there's more to say here, but in this case, youth and the making of urban criminality are part of the story of the colonial crowd. So my final example picks up on the theme of the role of women in crowd actions, which I mentioned in connection with the Morant Bay Rebellion. This case involves a protest by women in eastern Nigeria, the famous Women's War of 1929. This is the part of Nigeria where these protests took place. On the 23rd of November 1929, a mission school teacher tried to conduct a census count in the Igbo village of Oloko, located in Nigeria's eastern region. The incident occurred in a context where, as a later report described, women were convinced that counting was synonymous with taxation, so much that the terms were practically interchangeable. A woman named Inyanyarawa confronted the teacher and then made her way to the market in Oloko, where she gathered supporters. As the report went on, the first step of the Oloko women and those who joined them was to congregate at the compound of the Niger Delta Pastorate Mission, where the school teacher was employed, and to sit on him, which meant that when anyone has been wronged, he goes with his friends to the offender's house and prevents him from pursuing his ordinary vocations. It's not literally sitting on him, but it's creating a context in which you feel sat on. So they danced and sang outside the mission all night, eating and drinking palm wine and singing that Inyarawa had been told to count her goats, sheep, and people. By Sunday morning, they had, and this is a quote from the official report in the protest, by Sunday morning, they had worked themselves up into a state bordering on hysteria, and their numbers were steadily increasing. So this characterization of these women as hysterical represents a colonial stereotype. And this is rather undermined by the account of how they went in a body, as it's described, to Chief Okugo's house, who was the local ruler. In this description, the women seem to have been orderly and disciplined. We told him to come out and explain to us why he had ordered that women should pay tax. The chief answered the women rudely and abused them. Furious, the women attacked his house and decided to sit on him too, as they had done with the school teacher. The chief's servants then attempted to drive away the women with whips and sticks, but instead Chief Okugo was mobbed and had to be rescued by the police. Several women claimed to have been assaulted and injured in the melee, and Chief Okugo was ultimately charged with assault by Captain Cook, who was the colonial officer on the scene. He removed the chief to the town of Bende, where the local administration was headquartered. Over the next week, protests continued to escalate. On the 1st of December 1929, women began to assemble in Bende, demanding the immediate trial of Chief Okugo. As another colonial officer reported events, the women, numbering over 10,000, were shouting and yelling around the office in a frenzy. They demanded his cap of office, which I threw to them, and it met the same fate as a fox's carcass thrown to a pack of hounds. The station between the office and the prison, just round the office, resembled Epsom Downs on Derby Day. The crowd extended right way through Bende village, and the pandemonium was beyond all belief. Ultimately, Okugo was convicted of spreading news likely to create alarm, as well as assault. He was sentenced to 2 years imprisonment. The school teacher was also convicted of assault and sentenced to 3 months imprisonment. However, these convictions did not stop the protests. Rumors of taxation continued to spread, and women's protests sprang up across an ever-widening area until they were finally crushed in January 1930. Women's war participants directed their actions exclusively toward material property rather than people, European or otherwise. As in Oloko, crowds of women compelled chiefs to hand over their caps, the sartorial symbol of their position within the colonial regime. The crowd also destroyed or laid claim to the personal property of chiefs whose caps they confiscated, eating the yams from their barns, and in one case using the grass mats from the roof of a chief's house to make a fire to roast his yams. The freeing of chiefs' domestic livestock, goats and chickens, was another popular and symbolic form of punishment. No Europeans were killed or even badly injured during the month-long uprising, but 57 women protesters were shot dead in 2 separate incidents. So, these case studies are little more than a taste of crowds in world history from a chapter that I'm writing on colonial crowds. What differences and similarities can we draw out from these diverse cases across time and place? What do crowds reveal about colonial power? Thinking back to my earlier discussion, how far should we assess these crowds as examples of Le Bon's dangerous, uncontrolled mobs versus Ridet's targeted and directed rioters expressing legitimate grievances? I think we need to find a space that's between these two poles, not this either or of mobs versus controlled crowds, because all of these crowds seem to have been simultaneously volatile as well as remarkably disciplined. All of these crowds were protesting colonial power, but in Mexico and Jamaica, the sovereign power of the king and queen respectively was asserted as legitimate. What was illegitimate was a particular version of oppressive colonial government. In Cape Town during 1906, however, the government was cited as the authority, giving hungry people the right to walk into shops and demand food. And in eastern Nigeria in 1929, a crowd of women made a lone colonial officer feel that he had no choice but to throw them the cap of a chief in whom they had no confidence. So to some extent, what all these crowds reveal in different ways is the weakness and fragility of colonial power. At the same time, we observe how colonial power responded to these crowds and witness its brutality. But it's worth noting that the Spanish colonial state that the indigenous people of Mexico rose up against was very different to colonial Jamaica, colonial Cape Town, or colonial Nigeria. In describing these 4 crowds to you, it's not my intention to suggest they were equivalent in some way, But as with 2020, I'm struck that gathering and acting as a crowd was the form of social action that people took. So this returns us to the question of what a crowd is and how far we should understand crowds as made up of individuals with varied aims and objectives compared to a unified body of people that acts with singular purpose. Considering these colonial crowds, it's notable that they are all shaped by racial discourses in various ways. In Mexico, the indigenous people were racialized as inferior and bad-mannered, lacking appropriate respect for authority, but we also see that the sharp distinction between religious and political crowds proposed by Rude is misplaced in this context because this gathering of people came about in part for a religious festival. At the same time, there was a grain crisis, and in this sense, people mobilized to protest a lack of food and made claims and took action on the basis that they were entitled to more grain than was available. Here we see connections with food riots in late 18th and early 19th century Britain and France, and indeed the 1906 riots in Cape Town. Here again, a racial discourse shaped the manner in which the crowd assembled. Although it was ostensibly led by white British socialists who bemoaned a lack of food, the people who made up the crowd were not white. Most were mixed race or coloured, and many were likely the descendants of slaves. The label of hooligan was obviously a pejorative term to legitimate the claims of these men and women to have a decent standard of living and not starve. Racial discourses were also important in the Morant Bay Rebellion. The event occurred only a few decades after the ending of slavery in 1838, and many of those in the crowd were former slaves disillusioned with their experience of freedom. This crowd in part gained its sense of unity from being a gathering of Black ex-slaves and the descendants of slaves, who you might recall were instructed not to kill their colour. Colonial Jamaica remained a society stratified by race, and thus its crowds took on racial demarcations. Thus, we might say that colonial crowds were defined by who they excluded as much as by who they included. The final point I wish to emphasize about these colonial crowds is how they all had a theatrical element. But participants in these crowds used performance as part of their action. This was perhaps most explicit in the Women's War, where actions deemed barbarous or obscene by the colonial authorities actually came from an established repertoire of procedures to hold wrongdoers to account. The women used a distinctive symbolic performance genre to mobilize fellow women into taking political action. But more than that, the performance genre itself actually was the political action. It was a crowd performance that seriously intimidated the colonial authorities and their appointed chiefs. We see elements of performance in all our other examples too. The crowd in Mexico City ceremoniously carried the body of the woman killed at the grain exchange to the magistrate. In Morant Bay, the crowd played music as they came into the town and found time for dressing up in the prison. In Cape Town, the hooligan looters appeared to almost follow a script as they entered the shops of Indian shopkeepers. They nearly always entered as a pair, they made their demands, and then the crowd descended. And finally, performance begins us back to the 2020 protests, with which I began my talk. In the 21st century, the presence of the media shapes how crowds behave and provides an audience who's not physically present. The toppling of Colston's statue, for example, was most definitely a performance that was filmed on many a mobile phone. It is debatable how conscious the performativity of crowds is, but I do think it is an important way into understanding how they behave and why they take certain actions. So the observation I leave you with as a concluding thought is that analyzing crowds as performance enables us to connect crowds in the past with crowds in the present. Thanks very much for listening.